Bobbi is co-author of A Botanist's Vocabulary and also now Darwin and the Art of Botany, on which she's going to be addressing us tonight. So welcome, Bobbi. So happy you could be here with us.
So thank you all for attending. I am an illustrator, not a speaker. So if there's anything that you want to ask questions in the middle of it, feel free to interrupt me. And I'll be talking about my new book, Darwin and the Art of Botany. So this got published a month and a half ago, October 17th. So we're with my co-author, Jim Costa, we're quite pleased with how it came out. So this started with Charles Darwin. So he had traveled around. He's most famous for the origin of species and for traveling around the world for the 5 years, especially to Galapagos and all. So he's an interesting guy. And I hadn't done much with origin of species because I mostly just deal with plants. But when I found out about Darwin's house it's 15 miles south of London, apparently it's a beautiful home they lived in for 40 years with great plants that he grew in the gardens and a lot of climbing plants climbing up the house. And he did a lot of greenhouses to study plants inside them. So I've never been there, but I'm looking forward to doing that in the spring. And the main thing that I was interested in was the movement and habits of climbing plants. As an illustrator, I've been drawing lots of climbing plants, and I found out about Darwin's book about climbing plants, and it was a wonderful thing to read. He worked on 125 plants that he worked on in his book. So it was really interesting to learn about him. And he said he was fascinated and perplexed about climbing plants. So he did the great book. And what started with him, with Asa Gray, who is here at Harvard, Asa Gray had gone to Kew, and so Darwin met him there. And Gray had written an article about climbing plants. And so Darwin asked him about it, and Asa Gray sent him a couple of seeds that started the process for Darwin to germinate them and grow them. So his book of climbing plants, first it was published in the Linnaean Society, and it has all the twiners and climbers and tendril plants and a few hook climbers. And he was just so fascinated about them. So when I was reading the book, I was also enjoying all the climbing plants around my home. The wild cucumber it's one of my favorite things. It's a native plant. And that's the one that Asa Gray had sent to him with the seeds. And so when he was able to germinate that, he was able to study all the tendrils. So it's one of the most fascinating things for me to reading the book about. But then also Darwin had written about the grapevines, and that's up in the field beyond my house too. So it's for in my field, they grow it for the wine in Vermont. And there's also places in Vermont where they grow hops. And Darwin had done a lot of research about hops for the tendrils and the climbers. So as I go on and on about climbing plants, I love growing them around my garden. These are annual ones. They're tropical plants that are easy to grow for the summertime. So the morning glories and the scarlet runner beans are are the beautiful things, and they were all talked about in Darwin's climbing plants book. And I love seeing all the tendrils and climbers and twiners for all the different plants. So as an illustrator, I've been drawing a lot of climbing plants, and that's why I was so fascinated by his book. So this one I had done for the flowering plants of the neotropics. It's a Mexican species that is able to grow for the summertime. And it has fantastic flowers and great tendrils. And Darwin talked about the fact that the tendrils were the fastest spreading ones. They revolve more rapidly than all the climbers he worked on. So it's a fascinating plant, and I'm glad I illustrated, and I'm glad I see it all the time. And I had done a lot of illustrations for the vines of climbing plants of Puerto Rico. I'd done, I think, 300 species for the book. So the Marcrevia on the cover was one of the unusual ones, but some of the more common ones were the nasturtium, the Tropolium majus. And Darwin had worked on, I think, 5 different Tropolium species. So he was fascinated by that. So he worked on them in climbing plants, but then eventually I learned more and more. He worked on the nasturtiums in movement, about the leaves that sleep, and then cross-fertilization for the male and female plants. So I go on and on reading the book, and so glad about all that I've drawn. I had drawn a lot of passion flowers for the climbing plants of Puerto Rico. I think I had done 11 species with that. And Darwin had worked on 4 different passion flowers. He didn't even talk much about the flowers. All he cared about was all the tendrils of the passion flowers that were fascinating plants to grow. And I did a lot of other climbing plants for other jobs. So this was 66 that I did for the vascular plants of Central French Guiana. So I go on and on about climbing plants the more and more I read about Darwin's book. I had done a lot for the New York Times. So these were several for that, several more. And one of my favorite ones for growing in my garden with fantastic fruits was a Love and a Puff. And I had illustrated it for the vines of Puerto Rico. And then I had done a copper etching of it because it was such a great plant, seeing the fruits and all the tendrils that are, I don't know if I can see that. Yeah, so those are the tendrils that are right at the base of the fruits and the flowers. So after doing this one copper etching, I started doing a lot of copper etchings of climbing plants. And these are several ones that I did. And then back to Darwin's book. Darwin was in an era when the botanical art was the best. In the 17 and 1800s, it was such great botanical artists doing paintings, published in books, hand-colored. And when I was looking at Darwin's book, all he had was woodcuts. His son had done drawings, but there were a dozen of them in the book, 125 plants with only a dozen drawings. And, oops, sorry. So something, I don't know how this works. So yeah, that's the Love of the Puff. So it's just a tiny little drawing that he did. And the clematis over here. clematis is such a beautiful plant for the flowers and the leaves and everything. So just these tiny little things. And I was getting kind of curious about why Darwin didn't add art. To be reading a book to learn about plants, it's nice to see the pictures of them. And it would have taught people a lot more what the plants were like if he had included artwork inside his climbing plants book. So his best friend was Joseph Dalton Hooker at Kew. And Hooker was a great artist too. He had traveled all around the Himalayas and had done sketches, done really drawings, and then they were published. So Walter Fitch had redrawn his sketches, and they were all hand colored and beautifully published in the books. And I certainly wondered why Darwin didn't ask Hooker to help add artwork to him. This was on the drawings. Hooker had done a book about the rhododendrons. And so they're beautiful paintings. They were all sketches he did in the Himalayas and then drawn by Walter Fitch from Hooker's sketches. And so I've always been fascinated by the golden age of botanical art. And there was so much art in the 17 and 1800s. The Art of Botanical Illustration book, I had gotten that when I was in college. I was studying botany, and my professor, David Barrington, had given me that book, The Art of Botanical Illustration. And I was just really enjoying reading all the art from the 17 and 1800s. So soon after I was reading the Climbing Plants book, I went to Oak Spring Garden Foundation. Bunny Mellon was a garden designer, and she had a fantastic home and gardens. And it was just really cool to see all her gardens and all her plants. And these are 3 photos I took that I will show you later about the other plants that Darwin had worked on. So these are all ones that Darwin worked on, and they're all growing in Bunny Mellon's home. So at Oak Spring, there's residencies for horticulture and writers and poets and artists. So I was glad to go see it. I had a botany friend from Brazil who was traveling around the country doing botanical art workshops. So I met him there. We wanted to meet in person. We've been friends for so many years, but I've never met. So I went to Oak Spring Garden Foundation, and Tony Willis is the librarian there. And he started showing us all the art there. Not all the art, he showed us a lot of art. There's Bunny Mellon had 19,000 books and manuscripts of art. So it was amazing to start seeing some of them. So these are some of the snapshots I took when we were, when Tony Willis was showing the art. And as soon as I was looking at the art there, I was thinking, God, that would be really cool to see some of the artwork from Oak Spring to add into Darwin's Climbing Plants book. Well, I came up with that idea, and then at the New York Botanical Garden, Jim Costa was doing some research there. He's a Darwin expert, Wallace scholar. He's from North Carolina. He's a entomologist, but he was doing research at the New York Botanical Garden, and I met up with him, and I suggested that maybe I should do the Climbing Plants book with Oak Spring artwork. and Jim became my co-author. So we started working together. Um, he's a great person to work with, so I was very lucky with that. And we suggested the idea to Timber Press to do a book about climbing plants, Darwin's climbing plants. But the publisher said we should do all 6 of Darwin's plant books. So this was going to be a pretty interesting thing. And I'm fascinated by orchids. So that was one of the first plant books that Darwin worked on. So that was great to work on that. Insectivorous plants, Darwin only worked on maybe a dozen plants in that book. It was mostly on the Drosera. That was on nearly 200 pages of details for that. And the movement of plants, there's 400 plants that Darwin worked on. And then a lot in the forms of flowers and the cross and self fertilization. So I had to go through all 6 books and pick out 45 plants that we were going to put into a book. And I would do excerpts from Darwin's book to do it. And Jim was doing introductions for each chapter, talking about the plants and Darwin's work on it. So it was really good to work with Jim. This is how our book got published with 45 chapters that we selected on. So I had selected 8 orchids, 3 insectivorous, 12 climbers, 10 movements, and then a lot of the other books. And some of them we were going through the 6 books, but then we also started finding little excerpts from the variation upon domestication and the origin of species and a lot of the articles that Darwin worked on. So we had to keep trimming it out and finding things. So we are glad that we did the 45 chapters. And then the best part for me was to go back to Oak Spring to pick out the art from the 17 and 1800s. Tony Willis, the librarian there, would pick out books for me. I would look at their website a lot, and then he would find other books. For the 1900 objects, a lot of them are really huge books. Manuscripts, a lot of original art that was bound into books, and then some hand-colored books, book publications. So it was quite a treat to be going through there. When I was going there, I just kept taking snapshots with my iPad of all the beautiful art that I was finding. So these were all in the 17 and 1800s, and I have no idea if Darwin ever looked at artwork in those days. He certainly should have. And when he was working on passion flowers, it would have been so great to show what they actually look like. So it was a very popular era in Darwin's age. So I did these pictures, these snapshots. So I had to select one eventually. And that's the Oak Spring Foundation Library, which is a fantastic little library to hang out and look through all the books there. So these are several of the ones that I selected for the climbing plants book. The Bignonia, the cross and vine Bignonia, the cup and saucer vine, that's the one that I had illustrated a long time ago. That's such a great plant to grow in my garden. And grapevines, wild cucumber, that's the one that I showed you early on. That's a native plant around my garden. And passion flowers and clematis. So I was quite happy to select all those plants. And the next favorite thing was to find the orchids. Darwin was very active on the orchids. There were a lot of native ones quite right around his home. So the Spiranthes and Cypripedium and Heliborine are ones that are native around his home. This is the orchid bank that's right beyond his house. He and his wife apparently would go out there for lunch most every day, and they'd find all the native plants. So Darwin started pollinating them, finding all about the native plants. And he, in one of the letters he wrote to somebody, he said, "I never saw anything so beautiful." So then he also started working on exotic orchids that were collected mostly from South America, neotropical orchids. And the exotic orchids in the 1830s were so popular. They were all sent back from South America and then grown at Kew and different places. And it's amazing that they were such good plants for Darwin to work on the book. And his book ended up being very successful for describing native plants and the tropical plants. And the one time when he hired a excellent artist, George Sowerby, he had George Sowerby do the illustrations in just several days. Sowerby had to come to his house and draw the plants that were all in his greenhouses. And Sowerby had to work very fast. And Darwin said, "I am half dead with working with Mr. Sowerby," because I think he wasn't used to having people draw plants with him other than his son doing it. So this was one of the most interesting plants that Darwin had worked on. It's a copper etching that I did. I found it in full bloom at the New York Botanical Garden a few years ago. So it was Darwin's comet. And he worked with Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace is who he worked on the Origin of Species. And so what Wallace and Darwin figured out that the sphinx moth had pollinated it down 11 inches into the nectar. So it was really cool for Darwin to have learned about this way back then. So me was still fascinated by orchids. I had drawn a lot for the Greater Antilles. And Gustavo Romero here at Harvard, I have done a lot of new species for him. And it was always wonderful to work with Gustavo. He would send me a lot of the plants to dissect and draw. And then one of the most interesting things was Gustavo Romero had done an article about Charles Darwin in the tropical plants, the Cypripediums and the what were they? The Catasetums and Coryanthes. So he had done an article about it, talking all about how Darwin had published all the plants, and he corrected a few things. But what Gustavo did was he added some beautiful paintings into his article, and they were all from the mid-1800s. And when I had been looking at Gustavo's article, that was part of my decision to add art from the 1800s for the Darwin books. So I was really glad about Gustavo having done this article. So these are 3 of the orchids that I selected for our book. The Darwin's orchid and Gracum sesquipedium, theirs are white. The one I found it had yellow flowers, but they're beautiful plants. So they're chromolithographs, and Corianthus is a lithograph. But one of the best ones that I was finding at Oak Spring was the original watercolors and in vellum. So this was a native one, the Ophrys epifera was one of the native ones right near Darwin's garden. And then insectivorous plants, that was one of the interesting books that Darwin worked on. He was fascinated by the sundews, and he spent a long time, a couple 100 pages, showing all the details that he worked on for testing, adding liquids and bits of hair and toenails into finding out how the plants, how the bugs all died there. And he so I've hardly ever enjoyed a day more in my life, is what he said in an article. He was quite fascinated by the Drosseros. And so for a while, he was considering them as animals rather than plants. So it was fun to do all his research on it. And then the Venus flytrap, that's what he switched on to quite quickly. That was from North Carolina. And so when I was at Oak Spring, one of the first illustrations that I found there was drawn by John Ellis. And this was when they were describing the plant. So John Ellis had sent this to Linnaeus, and he had done an article about it. So it was hand colored in the article. And it was one of the most interesting things that Bunny Mellon had purchased. I was surprised that she had the original there. So I was glad to add that to our book. This, reading a lot about the Venus flytrap in the Darwin book is fascinating too. And it's partly because Asa Gray had connected him with people in the US to send plants directly to Darwin. So we're all glad that Asa Gray was so good. And then going on to the different forms of flowers, it was an interesting book to read. The one on the left here is the loosestrifes, and Darwin wrote a really good article about that with 3 forms of stamens and pistils. So it was a very interesting section to read. And my co-author, Jim, he wanted us to include that into the book. It's invasive plant here, so I feel kind of bad that I didn't add that one into the book. It's a beautiful plant, but it's way too invasive. So some of the other ones, the Michella that's the native one. And so Asa Gray had sent him the plants of that. It's all around in my garden. It's a great plant. And the primroses, this one is one of the main ones that Darwin worked on in the Forms of Flowers book for the pins and thrums. And the violets there. he did work on that for the Cleistogamous for self-pollination in the late summer. So it's all fascinating to read about this and be out in my garden looking at plants now, learning so much. Oops. So the effects of cross and self-pollination, that was a lot of the same plants that he worked on, including the primroses and all. But they were great plants that he worked on for the self-fertilization. And a lot of them he would let them be cross-pollinated, but then try self-fertilization to see if the plants worked well. So these are some in his autobiography. He wrote some great little great little sentences in the autobiography. No little discovery of mine ever gave me so much pleasure as making out the meaning of heterostyled flowers. I do not think anything in my scientific life has given me so much satisfaction as making out the meaning of the structure of these plants. He certainly considers himself not a botanist, but he's a very good botanist. I don't know why he was so shy about saying that he wasn't a botanist, because he sure did well. The other artist that he hired, Walter Hoodfinch, he had these two little drawings done. It's Walter Fitch was who did all the drawings for Hooker, the paintings, and Walter Fitch did so many beautiful paintings, but he did the two little drawings here. So what's called the pin and thrum, the long styled and short styled forms was what Darwin did a lot of research over for years for the primroses. And he did all the insect pollination. So when I was fascinated by the primroses, I got to find lots of beautiful plants at Oak Spring. It was a very popular plant in that era, beautifully painted primroses. There are several species that Darwin worked on, including I think a Chinese one and some native ones. So it was great to see all the ones at Oak Spring. And then the hardest book I had to deal with, the movement of the power of movement in plants, where there are 400 species, 400 plants there in that book. I had to decide what to work on. It was really a lot of interesting stuff. It talked about plants sleeping at night, geotropism, root tips, seed germination. And Darwin would take a lot of them out at night to see if they would die in the dark, in the cold. So a lot of them would collapse down at night on their own, but he would try to tie them up to see if they would stay up in the night, and then they would die if they weren't allowed to collapse down. So it's interesting now knowing that a lot of leaves collapse at night in order to stay protected. So then a lot with the power of movement was where he was checking out how they would sleep overnight, traveling around and around. The illustration here was in another book about Darwin's plants. So the ink trace, he and his sons and some other people would check it out every hour overnight for sometimes one night, sometimes 2 or 3 nights. So there are a lot of the things that he put in the book. And again, it was interesting to see how the plants traveled around overnight. So I'm glad that he did those illustrations, but he should have shown plants of them. So these were some of the ones I found at Oak Spring for the Power of Movement books. And they were from the English school. So all we know is that it was the English school. We don't know who the artist was. They were very accurate. We're guessing that whoever illustrated these was probably somebody who was a good botanist off on the side. So when he worked on the oxalis, that was the forms of flowers and movement, and the lupin was in the movement. When we were going through all the subjects, a lot of them we selected some from certain of the 6 books. So something like oxalis was in 2 parts of the books. Because Darwin worked on some, this one, the potato, that was in movement, variation of plants and animals. So he had just kept learning more and more about plants and all the different discussions of them. And so this was in the English school. The painting was on vellum and it was bound in a book. And it's amazing that Bunny Mellon had a book like that found away. And then one of the artists from that I found at Oak Spring was Jan Withos. This was from the 1670s, which is way older than any of the other artwork that I collected for the book. But it was just such beautiful paintings. So the 263 paintings were all bound into the 3 books, and they're on vellum. He was in the Netherlands doing the paintings. So these are 2 of the paintings from Jan Withos that I selected. The passion flower was for the climbing plants, and the morning glory was in several of his other books in the movement and several other books. So I think they're amazingly beautiful in the 1670s. Elizabeth Blackwell, she's a very famous artist. A new book all about her just came out a couple months ago. So she was, her husband was in a debt prison. So she started doing artwork of medicinal plants to try to raise money to take care of him. So she did 500 medicinal plants, and they were well published, and then republished a couple of years later. So it was very well done. But the most amazing part with other than the 500 published books, Bunny Mellon got 72 originals. So at Oak Spring, I got to see the originals. And so this orchis was one of the native plants that was right near Darwin's house. So he did a lot of pollination of that one. And these were 2 other ones that had been done by Elizabeth Blackwell. So the strawberries was in the movement book, watching all the climbers climbing around. So it's a beautiful painting, and it's fun to read in the Darwin book. And then the garden tree, that's one of the originals by Elizabeth Blackwell. So Darwin worked on that in the variation of animals and plants, and also he did it in the origin of species. So we took excerpts from the origin of species for that too. And then George Dionysius Aret, back then in my college, he became my favorite artist. He did such beautiful paintings. He worked with Linnaeus. He worked with, I think he was in German, but then he traveled all around in Paris, and he was in England for a long time. And so he did great art there. And Oak Spring had several originals that were actually framed up. But then the bound book that had 37 originals. So I was very pleased to find the dianthus, because Darwin had worked on the dianthus for pollination. And these are two other ones he did. Pinguicula was one of the insectivorous ones. And cyclamen was one of the movement plants. So these were quite attractive paintings. And so I'm so glad I knew about it way back then. And so glad that Bunny had originals. And then I found out that Aret had taught a lot of aristocratic women. So Lady Frances Howard was one of the artists that he taught, and she did beautiful paintings. So the digitalis was in cross fertilization, and the sundew, the Drosera, was in the insectivorous plants. And then another artist that he taught was Dame Hamilton. So at Oak Spring, they have 162 originals. They're all on watercolor on vellum. They're not bound, they're all in archival folders. The original paintings on vellum are so beautiful. So the primroses Darwin worked on them in his Origin of Species book, but then also in different forms of flowers. And these are some more that Dame Ann Hamilton had painted. And again, I think these should have been bound into Darwin's books because they're so beautiful. So the mimosa was in movement. He had seen that when he was traveling around in South America, but then it was a very popular plant for everyone to watch the movement of the leaves closing down at night. So he did a lot of research about them. And then Phaseolus, that he worked on that, the scarlet runner bean, he did that for pollination. And the morning glory he did in fertilization and movement. So the morning glory was not in the climbing plants. It was just in mostly in the movement. And another lot of art that I saw at Oak Spring was two sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret Wharton. They had done native plants. So they did 320 native plants around the 1800s. They did the overall habits, but then a lot of detail of the flowers all dissected. So it was quite fascinating. The Trifolium, the clover, Darwin had worked on that in the Origin of Species, cross-fertilization, and movement. So he was very active working on the clover. And then lungwort, the pulmonaria, that was in the forms of flowers. So they were these two sisters with their 320 native plants were bound in two books. oak spring. And the Cypripedium was Darwin's native orchid that he worked on. So that's all what I'm showing. You can show any questions. This was a picture of Smithsonian Magazine did this in 2019. Darwin is so black and white, and I do black and white illustration, so I can't complain about Darwin doing too much black and white, but I love this color with him showing all the artwork next to him. It was quite attractive. So that's it. The Timber Press is where we did our book. I had done the botanist vocabulary at Timber Press, so that's how they let us do the Darwin book. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but recently I've been reading the letters of Asa Gray, and he apparently, his wife, Jane Loren Gray, inserts little paragraphs about his life between the letters. And she said it just fascinated Asa Gray that he grew climbers just outside the door, and she would often find him taking a break from the work and looking at the climbers outside the door, apparently. You know, so I could see why he got Darwin interested.
Yeah, because he had
Very invested in it. So
yeah, he had written the article, and that's what Darwin read about and got fascinated by climbers.
You use the term copper etching. What is a copper etching?
I do copper etchings on copper.
So is it like you scrape off the copper somehow?
Yeah, I put a cover on top and carve into the,
Okay.
and then I etch it in acid, print it.
Can you speak a little bit more on the experiment that Darwin did with the runner and tracing where it went overnight?
Yeah, it was sort of hard. The one book where I saw the drawing 20, I think it was 25 years ago, she had done the drawing. So he didn't show any pictures of how he actually did it, but he had his piece of glass on top of the plant, and as it turned around, they would mark it on the surface every hour to show how it was turning hour by hour overnight and during the next day or two.
So it's going to be a big question, but how is Botanical information changed?
Well, there are a lot of botanical artists drawing paintings. It's very popular right now. But back in those days, it was a lot of new plants that had gotten brought out from around the world. And so especially from orchids, but then also so many other passion flowers and all that were new plants. So they were published, they were very expensively published because they were hand colored. So it was all for the wealthy people to get the books in. And I think a lot of the books were published early on for botanists mostly, but then also for horticulturalists. So, and I think, yeah, I don't know. I just got a new book that's all about scientific illustration because it showed what the plants were, because people didn't have photographs of the plants then. They needed to see the artwork to know what they looked like.
There's a question in chat from Lorraine Washburn. She says, did you consider any paintings by Maria Sibylla Marion? Was there anything she did that related to species that Darwin worked on?
Yeah, no, I looked at a lot of her art, but no, I didn't see ones for her plants. So that was too bad. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, in this fast-paced world where everyone's taking hundreds of photos of their smartphones, and anything that takes time seems like it, falls by the wayside. And I grew up in a time where, illustration was part of what we learned
Uh-huh.
as our scientific training, but it's less and less so, and people don't even want to touch something now. They prefer to take a photograph.
Yeah. Mhm.
How do you see the future?
Well, I think a lot of artists do artwork from the photographs. And several of us only like working from direct plants. When I had to do a lot of the illustrations for the New York Times in the middle of the winter, I sometimes had to do them from photographs, but I really like drawing from original, from live plants. And most of my best friends who are illustrators do it from the live plants too. I like taking photographs too, but they're just stashed away. So for the botanists, I work mostly from herbarium specimens. So that they're all pressed flat, so I don't have to worry about whether they're alive. And then when I do my own copper etchings, I do sketches and from the live plants, and then do a design from all my sketches mixed together.
I had a related question, which was, is it your preference to draw from a live plant or an herbarium specimen?
I like both. I really like working with the botanists. I like drawing new species for them. And then on the side, I like drawing live plants. So that's good. And so when I've done some of the field work, going to Puerto Rico and going to French Guiana to do sketches out in the field, and that was the best part.
But two things. I think I understood you say that you chose the plant and then went looking for the art. So you weren't trying to find plants and sort of a piece of art that you'd also, in fact, talk about. So how did you choose the plant first?
It was a challenge. Yeah, so I wanted ones that were well written by him, that would be interesting for other people to read about, and also plants that would be attractive art-wise. So I had to go through. I wanted to pick several from each of the 6 books, and it was a challenge. It was easy enough to find. I think I had 10 or 12 from the climbing plants, and the orchids was easy, but going through the other books was a challenge. The insectivorous plants, I only picked out 3 of them.
So was the library like indexed by, so that you could easily find out whether there were multiple different illustrations of particular plants?
I had to search and search for some of them.
Did you put your signature onto your work, or how about all the other documents? Did it often do this, or like?
I do a little VA signage. I don't do that on the etchings. When I first started doing illustrations, I would do it as Bobbi Angell, and I just wanted it to be more remote, so I do the little VA.